Welcome again to our online Bible class from Pine Valley Church of Christ, and we are continuing our look at the book of Numbers. So we have called it The Journey into the Wilderness. And there are so many parallels that we can see and think about as we think about their journey through the wilderness, God's provisions for them, the struggles that they had, and the things that we deal with on a daily basis, going through life in the world in which we live. Which is very much like a wild wilderness. We have been moving on in these 40 years of the wandering while God waits for the older generation who had refused to listen to him, who refused his promises, and refused to go into the land because they did not trust God. And so he had proclaimed that out of that generation, over the age of 20, only Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who spoke faithfully and defended God and his plan, would be the only ones to enter into the promised land. When we come to chapter 16, we are not exactly sure how much time has passed by since the spy incident. We have some travel information given there, and we're given some more during the chapters we're going to look at today. But there are a lot of connections between what has happened in the past and what's going to happen now, because this group of people have just continually grumbled. They have resisted the leadership of Moses and Aaron at times. Even Aaron and Miriam, Moses' sister, have at a time tried to lift themselves up and put them in the same place as Moses. And God says, no, that is not who I have chosen. We're going to have a very similar incident today, except it's from outside the family, though part of it comes from the tribe of Levi. The others come from the tribe of Reuben. And this begins in chapter 16. But I want us to see the connection with things that are going on in chapter 15, which we've already looked at, but it has discussed some of the other offerings that are to be made at certain times. And one of those is for unintentional sin. In other words, the person committed a sin because they didn't know it was a sin. And there is a cleansing ritual for that. But also talks about intentional sins. We see in verse 30. If anyone who sins defiantly, whether native born or alien, blasphemes the Lord, and that person must be cut off from the people because he has despised the Lord's word and broken his commands, that person must be cut off. His guilt remains on him. And goes on to describe a situation where an individual intentionally breaks the Sabbath, going out and gathering wood, which was work. Building a fire was work, and had been specifically prohibited to be done on the Sabbath. But this person does it intentionally, does it defiantly, and when Moses goes to God and asks what must be done, he says he must be stoned to death. He is not just removed from the community, but he is an example that is set to show that this is what sin deserves, especially when it is defiant and intentional in the way in which it is committed. This leads us into chapter 16, where we see a very similar attitude based on coming from Korah, son of Izhar, son of Kohath, the son of Levi. So he is a Levite. He is from the Kohathite tribe, which we know is one of the tribes or the clans within Levi. And they were put in charge of carrying all of the most holy things in the temple. Only the descendants of Aaron would be priests, but the Kohathite clan is given a very important responsibility, but they weren't priests. And then there were some from the tribe of Reuben, Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, and they became insolent They rose up against Moses, and with them 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the council. And they came up as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Let me pull up our screen share and sort of get us into this whole situation and what's taking place here. We have seen a lot through the book of Numbers and discussions about purification and keeping the people pure so that a holy God can live in their midst. But there's a lot of process that goes into making something pure, whether it's purifying our water, whether it's purifying gold, or even purifying ourselves. There are things that have to happen to remove that which contaminates. And we're going to see a series of events here where God purifies the community as a whole by removing from it that which is contaminating. And here is one of those examples. Again, Korah is a Levite and from the tribe of Kohath, but he is not a priest. And so he's part of this leaders of this rebellion. And in essence, we see that his attitude is about, why can't we be priest? Why can't we be in leadership? The other men are from the tribe of Reuben. Reuben had been the oldest of Judah's sons, or Jacob's sons, and had been replaced in supremacy amongst the brothers. One, because he had slept with his father's wife. And we've seen some other incidences where now Judah has taken over. And even in the layout of the camp, Judah is out front and Reuben is in a secondary role. The Kohathites and the Reubenites, in terms of the camp layout, were somewhat close to each other. They were on the same south side of the tabernacle when they were in camp. And so maybe there's some connection there in them getting to know each other, them having some of the same gripes and desire for power is really what this is. And Moses says, "You've gone too far." They tell Moses, "Y'all have gone too far." Moses later tells them, God's the one who chooses this. And he's going to show you tomorrow morning who is going to be chosen. And if all of you will bring censers with incense in them to burn before him, he will make sure it is known to you. But he pushes back on Kohath and the Levites and says, "Now listen, you Levites," verse 8, "is it enough that God has separated you from the rest of the Israelite community and brought you near to himself at the Lord's tabernacle? You have been given an important responsibility." And their claim that the whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them, is true. And God himself had proclaimed that they were going to be a nation of priests before the Lord, a holy nation in Exodus 19 as they came to Mount Sinai. But that doesn't mean they all have the same responsibilities. And throughout this section, we're going to see how the priests are given this superior position, though it's not superior in terms of the way we think of it in today's world. It is a responsibility that is given to them because of the need for sacrifice to purify the people. And he says it in verse 11, Moses says, "It's against the Lord that you and all of your followers have banded together. Who is Aaron that you should grumble against him?" He then sends word to Dathan and Abiram and says he wants them to come be part of this whole thing, and they refuse to do so. Says, isn't it enough, verse 13, that you have brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us here in the desert? Here is their reflection back on their time in Egypt, where they had begged God for deliverance. Now, a little over a year later, they see Egypt as a place flowing with milk and honey. They've already tried to go back. God has not allowed them to do so. And so here is another effort at a coup to take over the leadership to possibly go back. And they even refuse Moses's command for them to come be a part of the situation. So Moses becomes angry and says to God, do not accept their offering. I have not taken so much as a donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them. And it is the next day when they all come together. Korah had gathered his followers in opposition to them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And the Lord said to Moses, separate yourselves from the assembly so I can put an end to them. And Moses replies, oh God, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins or a few men sin? He wants him to, point out the ones who have really brought this about. And it is Korah and Dathan and Abiram. People are told to move away from their tents and their households, and the ground beneath their homes opens up and swallows them completely. And this doesn't mean, it couldn't mean, by the way the camp was laid out, that their homes were all next to each other. But this is a witness to the people, or an example of what happens when you are defiant in your resistance and in your sin. And then the 250 men who had been following them, who had been offering their incense, fire goes out from God and kills all of them, which harkens back to the time when Aaron's two sons had offered unauthorized or in the wrong attitude the incense before God, and they had been killed. And so those 250 are killed, and then the whole place feels like they're doomed because of what's going on. But it's the next day, verse 41, that the whole Israelite community comes out and grumbles and says, you have killed the Lord's people. But again, they're in opposition. And when they turn toward the tent meeting, suddenly the cloud covered, the glory of the Lord appeared, and he tells them, get away from the assembly so that I can put an end to them at once. And a plague breaks out amongst the people. Moses tells Aaron to get his staff and censer, fill it with incense from the Holy of Holies, and carry it through the crowd. And he offered incense and made atonement for them, verse 47. And he stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. This has just been further rejection of God, and they have already been cursed to die in the wilderness. Now, something I want to mention is the fact that whether it's the individual who had gone out and gathered wood, whether it was Korah and these people, or as we're going to see later, whether it's Moses and Aaron, just because they do something that causes them physical death doesn't say anything about their spiritual judgment that they will face before God. And it's not for us to do. This is God using these people as an example, a visual aid to the rest of the people. Look, this is how serious it is to be in a covenant relationship with a holy God who makes certain demands on you, and who also provides sacrificial system and priests to offer those sacrifices to make atonement for you, and so that he can live in your presence. And if you reject those things, you reject his holiness, and you reject the promise that goes along with that. He gets chapter 17, and he says, okay, we're going to remind everybody of God's choice here. And he has someone from all the tribes bring a staff with the tribe name written on it. They put them in the tent of testimony, or the tent of meeting. And he says, the staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout and rid myself of the constant grumbling against you by the Israelites. So Moses instructs everybody to do so. And the next day when he goes in, not only has Aaron's staff budded, but it has not only sprouted, but budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. I do not know how long it takes for even a living almond tree to reach maturity where it can produce almonds. But it's definitely not overnight. And this is coming from a staff that has been with Aaron for at least 40 years now, that the wood has no life in it. But God has, again, shown, this is who I have chosen. And the staff from then on is to be kept in the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant as a reminder to the people of God's choice. And God gives everybody within the community different responsibilities, different gifts, different things he wants to do. And even though we as Christians are told by Peter and in other places that we are a priesthood of believers, we are a holy nation, referring back to the very same thing God said to the Israelites. That does not mean we all have the same responsibilities, and there's no need for any kind of leadership that we can all just do whatever we want. God still instructs that we look to those who are mature and more Christ-like in their own lives to lead us, because it will help us all stay on the right path, going to the promised land, and remain faithful to God. When we get into chapter 18, there is reminders. We looked at this when we looked at the different offerings that are given. There's a review of the responsibilities that the priests have and the responsibilities that the people have then to the priest, which is the giving of the tithes, because they have no land, they have no inheritance, and the tithes will take care of the priests and their families. But when we come to chapter 19, we get into this whole purification system that is set up by God. And we are given this process in which they make, in essence, we might call it today, holy water. And the whole thing sort of elicits a vision of blood being mixed with water, because this is one of the only times in which they find a red cow, and it is sacrificed, the whole thing, and burned up completely on the altar, or on the altar outside the camp, overseen by Eleazar, Aaron's son. One of the only times that the blood is consumed with the sacrifice. Usually the blood is drained first. And it is from this ash that is created, then that it is mixed with water, And he says, this is to be something that will purify them and help, be a purification from sin. And he goes on to describe different situations, especially the touching of a dead body, and how that purification is to take place. And it is this special water that is used as a part of this because of the contamination that comes from death, because death is caused by sin in this world. And when a person has died, they enter into the realm of the dead, and touching that body sort of connects us to the death. And so we must be purified from that. And it's interesting that it is this blood and water mixed together that brings about this purification. And even in certain situations, they are to bathe themselves before they can return to the camp after a certain amount of time. There's some interesting allusions here, I think, to the New Testament. In John 19, John is the only gospel writer who mentions at the death of Jesus on the cross that his bones are not broken, which was in reference to prophecies made by Isaiah. And then that when the soldier saw that he was already dead and didn't break his legs, that he took his spear and stabbed him in the side, and came forth blood and water. Now he quotes from Zechariah 12 that they looked upon the one whom they had pierced. But if you keep reading after that, in Zechariah, it talks about a purification that's going to come from God himself. And it's quite possible, because we've seen other allusions in the Gospel of John to the book of Numbers, that he sees it as a fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. But you can see some connection all the way back to this mixing of water and blood as being part of the purification process, and purifying us from sin and the contamination of death. And of course, we know well from the teachings in the New Testament that sin and death are always closely connected to each other, because it is the result of sin that death has come into the world. As they continue on their journey, they now begin to encounter the nations around the Promised Land. And so there are some detours and obstacles which they must overcome, and some are caused by themselves. In chapter 20, once again, they have arrived at the desert of Zin. They stayed at Kadesh. We're told that at this location, Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, dies, but there's no water again for the community. And of course, again, they start grumbling, though God has cared for them for a long period of time, providing food and water in a desert that should not be able to support the millions of people who are traveling with them. And again, they quarrel, and they say things like in verse 3, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? They keep blaming Moses. And Moses goes to God. God again tells him, okay, well, here's what you're going to do. Verse 8, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. And you will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. And again, there will be respect for Moses and Aaron, as well as great honor given to God, that he is the one who is providing. But we're told in verse 9 and following that that's not what they do. They go to the rock. There's a sense of frustration on their part because they've been dealing with this grumbling group of people for so long. And Moses takes gathers the people and says, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock, referring to himself and Aaron. And Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. And so the waters there are called Meribah, which is the meaning of quarreling, because the Israelites had quarreled with God. And where he showed himself holy among them. But Aaron and Moses did not give him that honor. And again, though we know Aaron dies not long after this, Moses dies before they enter the promised land, though he is allowed to see it from the mountain. We have to be careful that we go too far in drawing analogies between our lives in this world and their wandering in the wilderness. Again, they gave up being able to see that or enter into that promise God had given them, but it didn't say anything about their eternal destination or their eternal judgment. And of course, Moses is lauded for his leadership and his humility and his faithfulness throughout the Bible, and especially in the New Testament. And it is Moses, along with Elijah, who appears to Jesus on the mountain when he is transfigured. But they had not completed everything that they were supposed to do, so they are punished for that. But it does not carry over into the eternal realm or the spiritual realm in terms of a judgment about their souls. They begin dealing with various countries. They come up against Edom. They do fight against Arad, beginning of 21. They journey on to Moab. They defeat a couple of kings there, the king of the Amorites, the end of the chapter, and God's giving them these victories. They are now, finally on the cusp of going into the promised land. And, God is with them. He is giving them victories over these surrounding nations, except one, which is in chapter 20, verse 14 and following, is against Edom. These are the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. And God had made promises to Esau as well. And so they asked for permission to go travel through their country, that they would stay on the main paths. They would not go into their cities and take anything or in their vineyards or anything else. They just wanted safe passage. And the Edomites refused. In fact, send out their army to show by force that they did not want them to enter. And so instead of attacking these like they do these other countries, God has them take a detour. And as we see in chapter 21, this leads to further grumbling. Edom are distant relatives, and so they do not fight against them. Other countries deny permission as well, but God uses that as a reason to attack and bring judgment upon them. But it is here in the middle of all this that they have, verse 4 of chapter 21, they have traveled to Mount Hor along the route of the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way, and they spoke against God and against Moses. And why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread, there's no water. We detest this miserable food. And so God sent venomous snakes out amongst them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. And they do come to Moses and say, "We have sinned." And there's some interesting imagery here. In their sin, what is it that comes and inflicts pain upon them and even death for some? And it is snakes, which takes us back to the Garden of Eden and the initial sin that takes place. And God curses Eve, he curses Adam, but he also curses the serpent, that he would crawl on his belly and that there would be this enmity there between man and snakes. And one of the things he says, the snakes would bite at your heels. And this is exactly what happens here. And after the people confess, God has Moses do an interesting thing. He says, "Make a snake and put it on a pole so that anyone who's bitten can look up at it and live." And so he made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. And when anyone was bitten by a snake, he looked at the bronze snake and he lived. Just sort of an irony there of the snake that had deceived Adam and Eve and causing them to sin here ends up being a symbol of, if you look upon it, gaze upon it, in other words, look to that which God has given you, you would be able to live rather than to die, which, throughout this entire section, there have been these images of blood and animals of no blemish, of holiness and purity in the camp, and death and life. And so, we're almost at the end of their journey. And next week we'll be looking at this very interesting story of Balaam in chapters 22 through 25. But God continues to reach out to them. He continues to give them deliverance, though against those who really rebel. They are killed, stoned to death, whatever punishment. This is what sin deserves. But throughout, God shows his true nature in that he wants to continue to live in covenant relationship with sinful people by providing for them a way of atonement, which of course we have in Jesus Christ. We all need purification from sin, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We know from the book of Hebrews, Jesus is our high priest and our atoning sacrifice. It is by his blood and the blood and water that comes from him, and the water that we are baptized by as we repent, confess our sin like the Israelites did, and put our faith in him, that we receive the forgiveness, the atonement of our sins. But as the writer of Hebrews points out in chapter 10, he only had to make the sacrifice once, unlike the Israelite priests who had to make sacrifices over and over again. And even in Hebrews 9, it references the fact that what Jesus has done, and chapter 9, verse 11, he came as high priest of the good things. He did not enter the tabernacle by means of blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, remember the red cow water, sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. It's also important that we, unlike many of the Israelites, avoid the distractions that come in, whether they're our own selfish wants of power, responsibilities, wealth, whatever the world around us keeps trying to distract us with. And stay focused. Lift our eyes to the one who has been sacrificed for us, whose blood has cleansed us through the waters of baptism. Because there is a direct reference to the bronze snake image in the book of John, in chapter 3, right before the verse that everybody quotes, John 3:16. Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. It's a powerful image and a powerful message. Then he goes on to say, John, in commenting on the statement by Jesus, because God so loves the world. It is only because of God's love that he did this. We sin against him, we are defiant, and we deserve death. But just as he was constantly seeking to bring life to the people of Israel in the wilderness, he has done so permanently through his son Jesus. All who believe in him, they have eternal life. As I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at a fascinating story of the prophet Balaam and the things that happened, and this vision of hope that it actually gives us here at the end of this 40 years of traveling in the wilderness, and the last of that old generation dies off before there is the new generation introduced to us in chapter 26. So that's where we'll be going. I hope that you'll read ahead and look at that between now and next week's lesson. Hope God will bless you and keep you safe.